Throughout my research, the convictions I have come across have not lined up with any known so-called force apart from energy, manually driven. Although gravitomagnetism itself possesses automated fields, they hold extraordinary promise. However, some insight has come via those emerald tablets. Although no verifiable evidence as to the actual existence of these tablets have come to light, the writer indicates that space is conscious, or has a consciousness probably associated with intelligence, or an intelligence which differs from our perceptions of what consciousness indicates. The common definitions via mathematical scrutiny. Perhaps, in the writer's awareness, consciousness includes a time-space automatic in the conscious phenomena. Or to further this concept, we do not create it. It is already there just as Iceland is there. We don't see it, but until we go there. The writer also seems to signify that space is divided by time, which makes sense, as measurements of time by absolutists of mathematical infallibility are substantiated according to how energy moves through space one-dimensionally. Manually based, pushing action established from an originating source, say the touch of a human finger displacing a small cedar block across the smooth surface of a table. That being said, no interaction with space is happening apart from the calculus of displacement through the accommodating space. Logic note, assuming the aspect and possibility of alien tech, the transport method to cover the vast distance of space could in no practical sense be realized using any manual form of energy. This tends to suggest the usage of a fifth or higher dimension access to link the vast distance to a conformable and acceptably easy transportation bridge. This further indicates that with such awareness that the aliens either originate from one, or many aliens originate from them, of these dimension or have direct access to, and from them interstellar speaking. 3. The so-called scientific definition of potentiality is spatial, of or pertaining to space, not a function of the displacement of mass from the manual input of energy that produces that output. This is because the resultant output of velocity or change in velocity, more power, is geometrically self-regulating by potential to the manual input in the form of so-called gravity, attractive force/pull, executing through the potentiality. The false term of potential associated as energy, that is potential energy. Potentiality does not possess properties of energy until actualized in opposition to manual input of energy to a mass, and therefore with more manual input of power to the mass, the geometric feedback of potentiality requires repetitious input to evade the drag of potentiality, increasing exponentially with exponential input of energy to the mass. Because it is self-regulating, it would be a function of space, and not a function of any energy establishment, but is coupled to it through manual input, making feedback automatic. Figure 1. Generally, this is due to the oversight that the imaginary reference of a line segment, also based on energy, represents a section of distance that is two directions in one. The two in one directions are only a result of manual energy transfer. The mass responds with automatic potentiality, creating the degree of freedom, and thus, generally speaking, is the reason behind why the mass is inhibited to 1df as opposed to possessing the ability to access two directions simultaneously. Previously, in my book Concepts Behind Aleodeology, it was my belief that this 2 inches -1 distance time was the reason behind the inhibition of mass to access simultaneity, but it was not. It was in fact potentiality of mass automatically established with the establishment of energy through manual input of manual energy. I do not know if this distance is fractionated, similar to fractals, without respect to the involvement of energy through space, since the math also is self-referential, originating from energy-based observations. This differentiates itself from potential, it being the cause of degrees of freedom, because manual input of energy to / for a mass or set of masses requires repetitious input to evade feedback, potential /g. Thus the self-referential math derived as well from manually based energy observations measures the displacement of the input to output through space, and additionally reveals delimitation to a set of degrees of freedom equidistant to the center of the mass, circulating in paths of 360 degrees that conforms to a sphere. No matter what new area of the mass may be relocated to in space, it will always be constrained to this sphere, which it can take up through energy, and adopt all rotations within it equidistant from center of the mass or set of masses manually driven by energy, because the DF are the result of potential in output as well as at equilibrium. Figure 2. Imagine this as analogous to a die going through all combinations and permutations equidistant to the center of its mass. When it completes a set of permutations, there are repeats. System science, contextually, refers specifically to self-regulating systems that are self-correcting through feedback. System science is analogous to space without respect to energies passed through it and would qualify as a self-regulating system, or dimensionally interdependent system, S2, which is analogous to system science. It can be viewed as space deserving of a meta-language that would describe it and its connectivity toward identifying how potential determines the pre-required repetitious input of manual energy that actuates potential from space through energy /mass, and exponentially with more power, acceleration. A meta-language not constrained to manually based input, which not only results in DF caused by potential /g, as it relates to space through energy transfer to mass or a set of masses, but also necessitates repetitious input to evade potential /g. That being repetitious input is the result of potential, and potential causes DF. Remember, however, that the product of potential in manually established energy transferred to mass in one direction is of course a self-regulating system, one that differs substantially from manual, repetitious input, and is thereby automatic. Therefore, to assume that it is the result of energy manually transferred to a mass or set of masses is to incorrectly suggest that potential is just as manual as the manual input of energy to a mass or a set of masses that necessitate repetitious input to evade returning to an equilibrium state. Potential /g therefore is the origin of the F from 2 inches -1 directional 2D space, represented by an imaginary line segment representing an actual section of space as it is measured through energy input to mass to travel through space coupled to manual input of energy to mass, a function of the mass with respect to energy. The time factor is distinctly a function of the measurement of mass conveyed through space in an amount of time that is self-referential, because it is manually input, which result in repetitious input to avoid returning to and decelerating back to a state of equilibrium or so-called rest as it would be defined. IV. To be convinced that space is anything more or less than a void is to admit to lunacy. Job 26:7. He stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. In other words, space is a void, a nothing. To even begin to suggest that it bends due to mass affecting gravity is absurd. Scientists are led to believe that Einstein's theory of relativistic absolutes are factual, proof backed in mathematical evidence. logic and tripe embedded in falsehoods contrived by contradictions, which distort the truth, discredit logic. In essence, it's wrong way round supposing that blue is pink, white is black and green is purple. If we are to believe men as opposed to what the truth indicates, scientists will disregard these truths because they fly in the face of Einstein absolute beliefs that show the secret of space, which as we have shown is absent of time, but rather it is energy that self-refers itself as functioning geometrically with respect to its passage through space. Believing these self-referential absurdities is to believe that the straight line is not the shortest distance between 2 points, and that the Earth squashes those who live on the south end of the Earth, and strangely affect those who live on the north end of the Earth. Because the mass of the Earth warps space in the presence of so-called gravity. Space cannot be bent or warped any more than the shortest distance between 2 points is an arc or a zigzag. Because space is a void, and nothing cannot be bent or warped from the establishment of energy, regardless of its space or manipulative abilities. Therefore it is complete garbage to accept these scientists, and the false assumption they perpetuate as facts when it cannot. Period. Our answer then does not rest with manual energy through space or space itself, but rather with automated energy. Repeats are the product of potentiality. Without it, repetition could not happen. This is why simultaneity cannot happen. It acts as a safety valve in the face of time. In the field of quantum tunneling, aka the Casimir effect, quanta, in general photons, borrow energy from negative energy running a deficit to tunnel its way through a not-so-lengthy barrier to achieve passage through the barrier popping out the end, or so to speak. Commonly this relates to what is known as negative energy densities, a weird kind of realm of exotic so-called energy similar to antimatter. But it's not really anything to say the least. Think of negative energies with the following analogy. 0 is at least something, but less than 0 is less than nothing. Assuming this, and one should never assume anything, all sorts of faster-than-light phenomena would be possible using negative energy densities. However, isolation of exotic forms of energy from this conjugate energy is an impossibility. Sad but true, at least according to value-based mathematics. This has led to all sorts of discoveries in science, from MEPR to quantum teleportation, to wormholes to other impossible time-tropitic theories. However, according to the scientific community, potential energy is not connected to negative energy densities or exotic energies. As we have stated, potential energy is not a form of energy, and the mathematics behind these entirely weird, bizarre hypotheses are self-referential. Now, in assuming that logic tells us that potentiality has a lower realm below 0, and that is possesses no energy in it since it is less than 0, yet, according to science, it is connected to energy and therefore unisolutable. If we go back to the imaginary reference of a line segment, we have second/d in 1. It would basically indicate that not only does energy have the potentiality to become actuated, actualized, or actual from potential, but also includes lots of other phenomena as well, which isn't uncommon, since it has been observed in various causes, from people having potential to be better people or the potential of making a great catch. First, to understand this concept somewhat more, we must disassociate the term energy from potentiality. For example, let us assume that for every potential outcome of mass over a predetermined travel route or system of routes, that at each position is also an imaginary reference. The potential exists for something to occur, only that in our comprehension, of energy into motion through the transfer of manual input of energy, which as we know is automatically accompanied by potential requiring repetitious input to produce the output. It is the potentiality itself that cripples energy from going beyond FTL as it necessitates repetitious input. With more energy, more potentiality. We can estimate here that potentiality with respect to space gives the ability for actualization. But it is not subject to the rule of one particular system. So how input occurs is just as important to how output will be resultant. We say will be, with respect to the concept of time as a function of energy. Energy, however, is not the only possibility for actualization into real terms observed through the senses. There exist other potentials, which once accessed properly can be materialized into technologies similar to magic. So our approach must be different to actualize something from potentiality into observable phenomena. This differs significantly from the potentiality or potential outcomes on probability and permutations, which relies heavily on information theory. Probability also depends on repeats. Outcomes may seem unknowable, but they are limited to a set of possible outcomes. One outcome results out of a set of all possible, as Shannon has insinuated in his theory. Adding more probables gives more sets, and with more sets, more possible outcomes with respect to human factors and manual energy put into the system or systems against potentiality. Each outcome is a single result, as is information representations. For example, on a graph table, Big 6 and Big 8 are clearly labeled on the layout. 6 and 8 cannot result simultaneously. 6 or 8, however, can. The meaning is the decision, but it is unknown which result will transpire, even though all numbers in the set will eventually repeat at some point over time with respect to manual energy input. Like our previous example, potentiality is the cause of degrees of freedom. This potentiality, like a rod representing an imaginary line segment, can go through all combinations and permutations. Once gone through, repeats occur, and they can occur randomly, but with our rod the transfer of energy gives the direction, and all possible rotations can be gone through space in one direction, forming a sphere. Unlike probabilities, whether random or directed, potentiality dictates their degrees of freedom with respect to energy in opposition to potentiality causing it. Hence it differs from potentiality, because the potentiality is below zero, while possibility is +1, adding more energy-related observations with respect to energy. So the approach is wrong as it is with manual energy input. Yet the fact that there is an unknown factor before actualization suggests that potentiality functions on different axioms that can actualize into being. The problem then is the approach to actualizing what is required, and this cannot be through manual input, or the result will be inhibited output. When we differentiate between possibility and potentiality, potentiality separates itself from probability because it is below zero. We can estimate that the unknown factor is the potential for actualization, but what is possible for this actualization to become possible through potentiality will depend on the approach used to actualize what we see fit, and that can be anything. In other words, if we assume that we use an input which is automated as is potentiality, it would then be feasible to actualize an energy hypothetical that could abate, supersede potentiality, or could even manifest completely new forms of phenomena. Phenomena that could do things never dreamed of. All, of course, originating from potentiality. And why? Because with potentiality there is an unknown before it is actualized. This factors in that given a different approach, such as automated input, as it differs from manual input. The result, S, would be also be different, and the outcome would be different, and as such programmable. Potentiality is the instance of manifesting that which may be possible as it differs from the probable. The differential corresponds to the input producing the output. For instance, if the input is value-based, then it is manual with respect to energy, and therewith the output will always relate to repetitious input against automatic feedback of P/G. Further hierarching out to reciprocal, not necessarily in 360-degree arcs. Repeats constrained to a set of DF also repetitious by the input to output values of manually based energy against automatic feedback that creates repetitious input producing that repetitious output. The differential may be further defined by information theory, where information is a message out of a set of all possible messages, where the set of all possible messages are probable, as in a probabilistic set of letters or values that repeat, like to die for example. That is, the set is finite. Chance/gambling is repetitive, because the sets repeat at some random point, and again we return back to value-based manual energy, exposing that potentiality differs from probability in that which may be possible is not probable. Hence the impossibility of possibilities which correspond to phenomena exemplified by faster than light, teleportation, etc., is not possible in probability, because the possibility for such phenomena is not possible using probability, especially with sets related to energy input to systems incorporating manual values. For something such as these, lie in producing output with an input which may be viewed as automatic, and or disembodied from energy based on manual values or manual input of energy. The potentiality is automatic. Potentiality, P, is automatic. The transpiration is established with the establishment of energy, K. It therefore follows that energy is an automation associated to mass, and mass only. Energy or its automation apart from manual input to mass would appear as impossible without mass. That is to mean there is no way to separate mass from its partner mass, the phenomena associated with it, isolate it and fiddle around with it to see how it behaves. This leads to the assertion that space has nothing to do with so-called gravity, as it is nothing, and nothing cannot be affected by something. This should be clear. So-called gravity is the result of potentiality automatically established when energy is put into any system constituting mass, figure 1. It is erroneous to consider anything else outside of this, because it just doesn't add up and blanks will keep appearing as long as scientists refuse to consider this. These blanks are indicators of red flags that they need reconfiguring. Instead of concocting false beliefs that time can be traversed with fantastical space warps that can never be acquired, the focus is aimed at mass and its manipulation with respect to feedback or redirecting energy in an automatic fashion. As an example, time is automatic, yet perceptual, which seems to indicate that it is causing space, not merely coupled to it, consistent with behaviors that actually yield superluminal transport. The term automatic differs in its meaning from mechanization, like how information is automatic, and yet the signal from which messages originate have no physical identification as opposed to communication. However, the two seem to come one from the other, or be interdependent as our energy and potentiality are, and again seem to have their base in potentiality. Hypothetically speak, of course, as potentiality is automatic when energy becomes established, for as we know repetitious input and its resultant hierarchies of repetitious behavior distance. The more input of energy, the more potentiality acts to regulate the acceleration to a velocity, requiring more energy, and with it more input exponentially until a limit is reached where the energy required is beyond that capable of actual viability. However, if mass is manipulated in a way wherein it can loop or be automated in a manner that diminishes potentiality, perhaps through a feedback loop or automated feedback loop, the mass would behave differently where that in that when energy is put into the system's response will abate potentiality, and actually acquire the desired goal, of super speeds and or even teleportation, hence a pre-programming of your will. Mass is the thing which inhibits FTL, and it has been explained what is behind this. This is evidenced in the establishment of energy that when the input of energy from an external, manual force, transfers through a body, it's responsible unto repetitious input. The inhibition is resultant by mass itself in the form of P as an automatic response balancing, or becoming greater with the input of more manual energy to the body, exponentially causing an opposing drag, so to speak, and not a result of any unidentifiable gravitational force from so-called space, which is suspected as time. Gravity is nothing more than this. In simpler terms, the mass gains weight with more input of energy from any manual source. Repeats in the originating force are needed to stabilize or change velocity in order to avoid potentiality, as disengagement of the originating force results in a return back to equilibrium of the mass back to a state of non-energy transfer. Mass is the reason behind repetition of all physicalities. That is to mean spherically. Mass is also the reason why two directions cannot be used simultaneously, for to take one and appropriate the other requires that the mass come back to an equilibrium position, and be re-accelerate to a velocity. If we attempt to isolate mass from energy, such a disembodiment would fail to hold living organisms foreseen as a future representation of people in a spacecraft. No mass plus infinite energy equates to death. Simple logic here. If instead the mass is held in a self-sustaining equilibrium state at zero while energy becomes, or exponentiates to infinity. Infinity here means endless measurement, or never-ending distance, as in Frank J. Tipler's rapidly rotating cylinder. Such a system would ultimately fail due to an outer mass also of infinite proportions sustaining the original mass in an attractive state like that of masses on Earth, which would also result more infinite masses holding those two in place exponentially ad infinitum. This creates another problem even if such a system could work. Its preposterous nature itself could not benefit in either case, since mass and energy are intimately interdependent. The interdependency is seen in wave motion of a photon. One can no more isolate V and V from P, K and momentum. The only real, conclusive answer then is to assume that the output is the fruit of the input, the meaning that the output for all exemplifications is manually based and therefore would necessitate an infinite series of infinite manual forces backing the original force transferring the force's energy to push a body composed of, in a single direction accumulating energy onto ever-increasing velocities to a sustainable velocities to achieve rapid interstellar travel or any spin-offs. Since this cannot possibly be done with any reasonable aspect, the solution resides in altering the way in which manual input produces repetitious input that the mass uses in output, where the manual input itself is the initial force. Repetitious input that produces the transfer of repetitious input produces repetitious output from manual input. In more direct and simple terms, manual input, which is repetitious input, is entirely dismissed and substituted with automated input, self-sustaining input by, to and from the mass itself. Now, while this may seem at first absurd, it is not, and can be accomplished via feedback from the mass itself. The feedback or feedback loop can only originate from one source of the mass, and this source lies in momentum. By feeding momentum, m, from the mass back into the system, one obtains the correct formula for a self-sustaining feedback loop which regulates the dwarf velocity displacement candidate for control positively and negatively. Momentum, as in a photon, is the arc that transpires between the rapid interchange of Ke to Pe and back again into Ke. Arcs, like rotation, are constant changes in direction in a single direction. But in such an arc of a photon, they exemplify crests and troughs rather than completing a full repeat back upon itself. Such arcs are connected to acceleration and deceleration, and in a photon two opposing photons do not cancel when passing through one another less polarized. All that needs to be done here is agitate the system into constant change, S, in direction to stimulate the other motion categories, and feed that back into the system absent of a complete repetition as would be in rotation. This might be similar to an ignition key starting a car. The rest, if properly adjustable, begins the wheel of self-sustainment for the mass, and from here can be amplified for that goal of superluminal transport. Supposing photons have no mass, change in direction would indicate mass with change in direction seemingly induced externally with reflection at 100%. If mass is 1, it being neutral positionally, energy is 0 at rest, not manually induced via transfer of energy from an external source onto repetitious input against mass versus equilibrium. Mass is never 0 and energy 0 transfer. Energy at rest means that the energy transmogrification, establishment, from rest enables mass to change its current position to position, here from 0 on to 1. But with repetitious input, mass acts to become heavy, dragging behind energy the potency, to come to light speed with more input against itself. Mass. If mass did not change position with the transfer in energy to the mass, it would still become heavy. Position differentiates by energy perpetuating displacement to mass. A special adjustment in energy then would necessitate that it compensate for change in position of mass by energy to